Now, Professor John Tomaney is the Director of the Centre for Urban and Regional Development, University of Newcastle, United Kingdom. He's also Professor of Regional Studies at Monash University here in Australia. He's published, quite remarkably, over 100 books and articles, which I think is great, on questions of local and regional development, and has undertaken numerous research projects in the UK for UK research councils, the government itself and various government departments, the European Commission, the OECD, or the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, local and regional development agencies, and private sector and voluntary organisations. He's given evidence to the Royal Commissions and parliamentary committees in the United Kingdom, and in addition he's a regular commentator in the UK media on matters of local and regional development. Now, John is an inaugural fellow of the Institute, and we're very privileged to have him here this morning to give him, for him to give us his thoughts on these international perspectives of relevance to regional development. So John, welcome again, and it's over to you again. Thank you.
What I'd like to do is introduce an international perspective on these questions of regional development, and to focus in particular on an issue which Mal has also raised and Tom's just echoed, and that is this notion of regional potential. The idea that we think of regions in particular not as places necessarily with problems, which indeed many of them do have, but as well think of them as places which have economic potential. And if we start to adopt that kind of perspective, to look at some of the implications for the way in which we might act to exploit that potential. It's interesting to begin with a sort of general view of how we think about the world. This is, as you probably guessed, a map of Australia. What's interesting about this map is that it presents economic data in quite an interesting way. It looks at gross domestic product, essentially, I suppose, wealth. But instead of looking at it in terms of per head by administrative district, right, I think the secret is not to touch the podium, yeah. Instead of looking at GDP per head, in terms of administrative areas, it looks at GDP per square kilometre. And what it demonstrates is the extent to which wealth in Australia is concentrated in a handful of places. And those places are pretty obvious, the capital cities, but also some of the places around the capital cities, and in some cases, some of the mining districts of Australia. Now, this expresses really the way we tend to think about economic development in any country, not just Australia, that it tends to be concentrated in the bigger cities. And indeed, there's a whole area of economic theory which explains the advantages of cities as a place to do business. People concentrate in cities because there are many advantages to doing business in cities. There are what economists call agglomeration economies. That's to say, the advantages you get by having shared services, a larger labour market, and so on. And this has led policymakers in many countries to develop policies which favour cities, favour the investments in infrastructure, in education, in health, in the big cities, and rather to neglect some of the other potential that exists in countries, and in particular in regional areas. And one very important study which myself and colleagues have contributed to, which is about to be published by the OECD, and which Mal mentioned briefly earlier, has begun to examine the way in which, by focusing on cities, we often neglect the potential for growth that exists outside them. And what this study suggests is that less developed regions actually make a much bigger contribution to national growth than we traditionally have tended to think. So for instance, in the work that they're about to publish, they've demonstrated that between 1995 and 2007, predominantly rural regions actually enjoyed, on average, faster growth than their national economies. That's counterintuitive. We don't really expect that to be the case. They also go on to point out that broader-based growth can bring wide benefits for society. By encouraging growth outside of the big cities, there are benefits not just for those areas themselves, but for the whole country and indeed for the big cities themselves, in the sense that many of them, and I've just come from Sydney, many of them are suffering from severe problems of congestion, urban stress of one kind or another, pressure on services, which could be relieved by encouraging greater growth outside of those cities. So in this sense, they're setting up a view of these problems, which is not the regions versus the cities, but looking at the ways in which both can benefit as a result of more growth in regional areas. What they point out is that in regional areas, barriers to growth vary widely. There are lots of different barriers to growth, but the successful regions often have in common a few very key characteristics. First of all, is high quality human capital. We know from economics, there are many disputes in economics, many disputes in economics, but we know that one thing that virtually everybody's agreed on is that human capital and innovation are the processes which drive economic development. And in the regions which are outside of the big capitals, which have succeeded, it has generally been as a result of accumulations or improvements in human capital. The second thing which the study emphasises is that traditionally governments have addressed the problems of regions in terms of individual policy measures. A structural adjustment programme because a factory's closed, an intervention to improve schools or hospitals. But it's not these individual policy measures that make the difference and contribute to regional growth. It's integrated policy packages which look at the connections between different activities, such as skills, such as innovation. Thinking not just about building a new university, but then thinking about how that university is connected to the city in terms of urban design. These are the questions which seem to be important in all of this. So what they point to is the importance of policy synergies. Looking at these issues in a little bit more detail, what we see is the extent to which growth is indeed concentrated in a third of growth is concentrated in a number of key regions in each OECD country. But we see that some 70% of growth almost takes place outside of the big cities. And it's in this area, where the potential for gains in growth in this long tail of regions where the potential in gains for growth are most obvious. And if we could improve the performance of these regions in terms of that 70% or so, the contribution of that to national economic performance will be very significant. And just to emphasize the point, just to show that I'm not making this up, that there are statistics to support what I'm saying, what we see is that there are significant levels of growth in rural areas which have occurred in this period, 1995 to 2007. So we're underestimating, or we have been underestimating, policymakers have been underestimating, not just in Australia but around the world, the potential of these non-metropolitan regions to contribute to economic development. So the successful regions then tend to be characterised by the coordination of sectoral policies, so that we don't just think about what our policy for agriculture is, what our policy for industry is, what our policy for innovation or skills is. We think about the relationships between these policy areas. They also identify that the successful regions are characterised by sound or strong institutions that are effective at policy making and are effective at governing the implementation of policies. Typically, they tend to be inclusive. They tend to be concerned with thinking far ahead. They typically use those institutions to develop very sophisticated identification of strengths and weaknesses in the regional economy, and to build on strengths in particular, to be less concerned about weaknesses, but to identify strengths and to consider how those can be accentuated. And finally, many of these regions are focused on infrastructure to support the connectivity of regions with other places where they might export, the kinds of markets which have potential for them in the future. Now, Okay, you say, well, this all sounds very positive. We probably could learn from some of this thinking. But what does it mean in practice? Well, a couple of examples. Two regions, which some of my colleagues here have already heard me mention earlier this morning. Oulu in northern Finland, in European terms, a very remote and inaccessible part of the European Union, in the Arctic, certainly not part of the Sun Belt in the European context, snowbound for large parts of the year. Yet one of Europe's major high-tech industries, one of the major locations for the Nokia enterprise, a region which developed a strategy over a 20 to 30-year period to promote and develop an IT industry, stuck to that strategy over the long term, connected local firms to the university, built up the capacity in the university around electronic engineering, and as a result of that has emerged as this very important technology hotspot in the most unlikely location in the European context, well outside of the core of the high-tech core of Europe, which runs from the southeast of England through the Benelux countries and into Germany and northern Italy. Another example, slightly different case, a region called Styria, or Steiermark in German, in Austria, a region that underwent a massive economic crisis in the 1980s, based traditionally on steel and mechanical engineering. Those industries went into deep crisis, largely because they depended on markets in Central and Eastern Europe, which collapsed after 1989. There, the regional authorities did precisely this task of developing new institutions for policy making and governance, set up a new regional development agency, very effective, one of the most effective in Europe, identified the strengths and weaknesses in the local economy, produced some counterintuitive ideas of what their strengths might be. One of the factors they considered was that they're one of the most wooded regions in Europe, and that on the basis of this, they should regard this natural resource as a key economic strength. And what this region has become is one of the centres of the high-tech wood industry in Europe. Wood, they argued, can be a high-tech industry by investing in innovation, by improving the skills of the workforce. Now, this region has transformed its economic performance dramatically since the 1980s on this basis. Infrastructure to support connectivity is extremely important here. It's accepted that within that region, some of the smaller communities are not going to be able to support the new industries, but what they can do is connect those communities through public transport and other mechanisms to the major cities, such as Graz, where the growth is occurring. So these are examples of the kinds of success that are being identified in this study. But not all regions succeed. The ones that don't succeed run up against a series of bottlenecks, such as weak institutions for policy making, lack of mechanisms for including voices in the policy making process. They remain predominantly sectoral in their policy making approach. They often have fragmented labour markets. There's a lack of connectivity between places within the region, and they have low levels of human capital. How you tackle those problems is by having good governance mechanisms, according to this study. So finally then, I've argued that there is potential outside the metropolitan areas, not just in Australia, but in many countries, that internationally we're beginning to recognise that more clearly, that there are many reasons why regions fail, but there are a handful of reasons why regions succeed, and they're to do with good governance, identifying your strengths and weaknesses, high quality research and intelligence. And alongside this, according to the OECD, emerges a new paradigm of local and regional development, which focuses on underused regional potential, focuses on making regions competitive, tapping this underutilized regional potential through developing comprehensive programs to accentuate the potential, developing integrated and comprehensive development projects with wide policy area coverage, and I would argue with long-term planning horizons. It tends to be focused on functional economic areas rather than administrative boundaries. As I've said, it's long-term, and it's context-specific, and this is very, very important. Policies need to be developed that are appropriate to each place. The notion that governments in Canberra or Sydney can roll out policies to save the individual cities and regions of their states or countries, is an idea which is really questioned by this kind of research. The issue is, how do you identify your endogenous local assets, the assets which are rooted in your place, the knowledge which is rooted in your place? How do you build and develop on those things? And that includes improving the business environment, addressing labour market issues, providing the right forms of infrastructure. And it means that this is not just the responsibility of one level of government, but it's the responsibility of all levels of government, federal, state and local, working together and drawing in the stakeholders who have a stake in the future of that area. That includes the public sector, the private sector, non-governmental organisations, in an open and inclusive way. So my time is up, but what I hope I've done here is summarise what I think is a very important line of academic and policy work which is attracting attention around the world, in which I think is particularly relevant to the problems of regional Australia and to the potential of regional Australia, and hopefully also to the issues that you're tackling here in Wagga Wagga. Thank you very much.